What we're looking at here is an example to illustrate what I'm going to call the number one important rule in real estate and interiors photography. And what this is it's just an ambient shot. And as you can see through here, you see all these mixing colors. You have this very bright outdoors, and then the inside is relatively dark. It's having a hard time getting the light in there, and especially in that kitchen over there. And if I let it go any brighter, this window over here on the right is going to get really crazy, and then those can lights up there at the top are going to get crazy the brighter I let it go too. But this is a pretty good exposure as far as getting the room lit up. But I want to show you what my mind is sort of thinking, and I'll admit this is a little bit of an extreme example, but my mind is thinking when I look at this, I need to take control of this scene, and the only way I'm going to be able to do that is to add my own light. And so this is the exposure, believe it or not. In this particular instance, like I said, this is a little bit extreme, but it's at least 2, I think this was almost 3 stops darker than the ambient that lit the room. This was, I feel like, about lighting the room properly. And this, as I'm getting into now, is what the exposure I went to light the room. And this is the most important sort of rule in real estate photography, if you ask me. You got to get sort of your exposure correct, and then you, by just looking at it, and then at that point you're going to say to yourself, well, how much down do I have to bring this exposure? How much darker? And you might have to play with a few exposures to get it where you want. But in my mind, this is where I was at when I felt like I'm wanting to light it. If you can see that window over there, it's looking about in a good area to me. All these lights in the room, like that cool little light over the kitchen table, that's going to be looking really good in my final exposure because I've controlled it now, right? I've went about 3 stops darker, which is pretty extreme. That's what I'm saying. This is an extreme example. You might sometimes have to go 2 stops darker. I find that's a pretty good average. I'm saying 2 stops darker from your well-exposed ambient frame. You might have to go 2 stops or maybe 1 stop. It depends on where you're at, okay? And I also think it depends on how much work you want to do. The more work you're willing to do, kind of the more you're going to be able to get that ambient that you're going to light the room at, and you're going to be able to bring it darker, okay? So the next one we're going to look at here is my lighting frame. And as you can see, I had quite a bit of problems with this shot, but this is just my first lighting frame. But I just wanted to show you that was this frame, but with me lighting it, okay? That's how I'm starting my lighting process. And this is a little bit of a difficult shot because it's extending back in a lot of things, and not to mention I'm getting a dog and even my client coming in over there. But as you're going to get to see, the next one is the final shot, and as you can see, you would never ever be able to get this amount of contrast and this amount of color consistency with a frame like this. Okay, we're scrolling back to our, what do you call it, our ambient frame, okay? You're never ever gonna get there to this result by using that. Even in the trying to fix colors in a frame like this, you're getting a lot of sort of blue light sometimes coming in on the floors and things like this, and relatively warm light coming in from your cans. Well, if you just sort of take those yellows out or take those blues out, that's not really a natural way to desaturate colors. It can leave sort of a weird little like bleached out white spot there. It's just not a natural way to take colors away, to just play with sliders in Lightroom, okay? Also, as I was alluding to earlier, these canned lights you see up here, those can really start to blow. It wasn't so bad in this particular instance, but you'll see that haze in a lot of people's photos when they're can lights in their final photo, just sort of that haze. You don't really want that look. That's just not a good look to be having in your final photograph. So once again, you can never get this clean and this sort of color consistent of a photo unless you're really bringing that ambient exposure down at the start. And that's what I was saying, that lighting frame. This is that starting point. It's kind of a scary starting point because you got a lot of work to do. But we started off tough. So let's jump in there and look at a couple more examples of this and also discuss a couple more points. Here in this sort of cool beachy pool, it's sort of an outdoor bungalow attached to this house. I thought this was a really cool space. But what we're getting here, we're starting off once again showing you me exposing the scene with just the ambient light. And what I'm trying to point out here is this is about the exposure that you'd have to let everything go, your aperture, ISO and shutter speed, to get that room what I'll call well lit. But we're losing that window, right? So I haven't really named this number one rule in real estate photography, but what I'll say is what you got to do here, and what this rule is telling you, is this is looking good with the ambient, right? But ambient brings with it so many color problems. Not so much in this case, but just don't let that catch you up on at all. Ambient a lot of times brings with it a lot of color problems, and it also brings out what we're getting here, sort of highlight and shadow problems, where we're getting some really blown highlights here. So in this case, I found an exposure that was about I looked it up a minute ago. It was about 2 stops darker than our well lit ambient frame. Okay, and this is sort of something I have in my head when I'm working in the field. I go ahead and take an ambient, and I want to see something like this. I usually guess at it. That's how my personal, I keep my settings so much the same. I'm just changing my shutter speed. So I'm usually able to get a pretty good guess just looking at the walls and stuff and how bright they are. So in this case, I stopped down a little bit more than 2 stops, 2/3 of a stop. And it's looking to me, the reason I picked this is because we're really controlling those highlights now. Okay, we're really controlling. I want these people to see that they're going to buy this house, has this cool bungalow out here by the pool, and they're going to be able to see their guests. They're just going to be able to kick back. So I want them to really experience that in the photo here. So you're going to see my lighting frame right here, and that's lit, but that's at the same exposure as this. Okay, so I'm lighting it, and once again we're making the entire scene color consistent and also amazingly contrasty, at least relatively speaking. Okay, we're getting that contrast, we're getting that color consistency, we're getting little things like that light in the background. We've stopped down right on our shutter speed. We've darkened this photo, so those lights in the bathroom back there, they're kind of well controlled now. So that's great for us. So in this, we're just going to go ahead and look at the final photo, and you can go ahead and decide for yourself what was better. This is my final photo. I just grabbed this from my delivered folder, and this was the ambient, just a straight ambient, but with the room relatively well lit itself. Okay, so that's my final, and there's the room. Now before we get into the third and last example, I wanted to go ahead and jump back here to our first example, and this is a lot more problematic, and I want to sort of give you guys some guidance as far as how much darker you should make that scene. You're going to go in and flash it. Well, how many stops should you go underexposed? This scene right here, there's a lot of sort of extending back, and there's even a room back there. You might have 3 adjacent spaces in like a dining room or a living room you're shooting. So in those situations, I would say a real estate photo where you're trying to make a photo in about a minute, I would say tend to not go as dark. So don't do what I did here. You remember what I did here? I went really dark. Okay, that was probably maybe a little bit of a mistake, because I had to do a lot of lighting in this scene, going way back there into the depths. So maybe if I did this photo today, I think I went 3 stops darker is the difference here. I might go a stop and a half to 2 stops. And just to sort of continue that point, but we're looking at a different space now, right? We do have a space extending off onto the right there, but I want you to sort of forget that. I'm just trying to make a point here. When you have a more confined space like this, like a bedroom, just sort of a little box, and there's not, a kitchen, a dining room, and adjacent rooms all extending off into your photo, well, guess what? I feel like you can go a lot darker on that dark underexposed frame that you're going to light. And the reason is because when you put light into this scene, it's just so easy, right? You're not going to have to go back and say light a hallway that's almost impossible to light. Even though one of the things I'll say is our shadow booster within our Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom is really able to sort of boost up those shadows. So you can, it's just, the point here is you really want to sort of push it, but not too far, especially when you have a lot of adjacent spaces in the background. But in this case, it's not that big of a deal. It's just sort of a box bedroom. So I'm really more interested here in controlling the photo, since I can do everything probably from almost behind the camera. Maybe I might need to do a little bit lighting over in that room over there. But the truth is, it's pretty easy. I don't have to light something really awkward like some weird hallway or something. So this is how we've been starting off with the ambient frame, but the room well exposed. And you can see we're having that highlight problem. We're not really having a color problem because I have most of the lights off here, so the colors look pretty consistent just starting off. But as you can see down there by the bed, there's some sort of reds bouncing up on the wall. It doesn't even matter if you don't have lights on. Still, there's contamination all over the place in these photos because you're dealing with such varying sort of lighting sources on the outside, okay? And the light is bouncing off. And what you're doing when you really stop down and give yourself that base, that really underexposed base, is you're just saying, screw all that light that's sort of mucking up the colors in my photo. I want to take you to a place like this where I'm in control now. Now I'm going to put my own color corrected, perfectly white balanced light in here and just blanket it with consistent, what I'll call white light, okay? And what that's going to do, even where you do have a little bit of color problems, that white light is just going to come down there and sort of blanket it and make everything consistent. You see how that works? I am seeing a little bit of the spots, like a little just above that bed down there. I am seeing it a little bit, as we saw, there's a little bit of discoloration I can see on that wall over there, but it's not nearly as bad. Everything's so consistent. And so this is the number one rule, I would say, in real estate photography. Find that first exposure where you think that's really well lit, I'd say, where the room is well lit. And the way I use that, I'll go ahead and plug my courses here. You're going to have to watch my courses more, how I sort of turn these photos into more polished photos. But this is my initial flash frame. As we've been talking about, I really want to get that consistent base there. And then this is the final photo where I've just sort of maintained some of those shadows now, and I really feel like this is a bright and airy room now, and everything's clean, and you'll notice the colors are a lot more consistent. And I did my job, and that was even one of the points I maybe failed to bring up. This was an ocean view home, and even though this particular vantage point, I believe you couldn't quite see the ocean, but it was really important that I show the views from here. And so in this case, sort of the point of bringing up this example, I've waited until the end, but is that in these more box-like spaces, it's a lot easier to make a very quick photo, even though you're starting off maybe 3 stops below that initial frame. You're going down 3 stops and you're having to bring up the light in the room with your own lighting sources, okay? It's a lot easier to do in a space like this versus that first example we looked at where things are extending into the background in a very long space, or a hallway, or a space where there's, like I keep saying, there's sort of octopusing rooms going off in every direction. So that, on those situations, you want to play more with the ambient, meaning you want to start off with a little bit lighter photo and then try and light it, because that way those areas in the background are going to take care of themselves. I think always the foreground is usually the most important area of a photo, the foreground. But to take care of that background when you have a situation like this, once again, really get in there. Bathrooms also come to mind, just really small little bathrooms. Don't be afraid to really kill your shutter speed, maybe even 2 to 3. I'd say limit it at 3 stops under that initial exposure you were getting. And that, folks, is what I would call the number one rule in real estate photography. Just kill that light. kill that natural ambient light, because it is your enemy. Believe me, it is the worst thing you could possibly do to your photos. It sort of makes them hazy around the can lights. Everything sort of blows out in the wrong places. It just looks bad. You don't get the contrast. You don't get the consistent and professional looking colors until you kill it and then put back the light on your own.